بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم صلى الله عليه وسلم محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Continuing with our class on the four Gospels of the New Testament. Last time we talked about the Gospel of Mark, and we talked about how Mark is divided into two periods, the Galilean ministry and the Judean ministry. We also talked about something very important, major themes of the Gospel of Mark. We said some of the major themes are eschatology and expectation of the end of time to come immediately. And we said the reason for that is because of things that were happening around the world, major natural disasters. You have persecution of Christians in Rome by the Emperor Nero. You have the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. You have rejection of Isa alayhi salam by the vast majority of the Jews. So this immediate eschatology. We also said another major theme is the anti-Jewishness of the Gospel of Mark. And that's primarily because the Gospel of Mark is reflective of Pauline Christianity or Hellenistic Christianity, as opposed to a more Semitic or Jewish Christianity that was found in Jerusalem at that time under the guidance of James or Yaqub had-Sadiq, who is the brother and successor of Isa alayhi salam. So very clearly we have two different distinct strands of Christianity, even from an early period. You have Pauline Hellenistic Christianity, which eventually became the Orthodox Christianity, and then you have the Jamesonian Semitic or Ebionite, as sometimes is called, Tawheed Christianity, which believed that Isa alayhi salam was simply the Messiah and a prophet of God. And of course we have that reconfirmed in the Quran. Why did Pauline Christianity win? The primary reason is because when the emperor, the Roman emperor, becomes Christian, he becomes a Pauline Christian, and that was Constantine in 318 of the Common Era. If Eusebius's ecclesiastical history is correct, and there's a lot of question whether it is correct, but according to Eusebius, Constantine was fighting his enemies at the Milvian Bridge, and suddenly he looked at the sun, because he used to worship the sun. He worshipped the Sol Invictus, and he saw a cross in the sun. In fact, it was actually not a cross, it was the Chi Rho, the first two letters of the name of Christ, which happens also to be the symbol of Cronus, the father of Zeus. And when he saw that, he took it as a sign because he heard a voice that said, in hoc vince, or in hoc signo vince, in this sign you will conquer. So he apparently converted to Christianity, and some say he actually converted on his deathbed in 337 of the Common Era. The point is, when the Roman emperor endorses one brand of Christianity, then everyone is mandated also to follow that version of Christianity. There's no individualism in the Roman Empire at this point. This is a Christianity that he chose to go with, therefore everyone else has to sort of fall in line. So Jamesonian or Ebionite Christianity was basically marginalized completely, and this Pauline Trinitarian Christianity became the dominant Christianity. Of course, with the coming of the Prophet ﷺ, that original Christianity was once again revived and brought center stage with the revelation of the Quran. And the Quran really is a revelation that incorporates the essence of all of the previous kutub, all of the previous books of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So like in Surah Al-Bayyinah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He describes the Prophet ﷺ, Rasulun min Allahi yatlu suhufan mutahhara fiha kutubun qayyima, that he is reciting scrolls that are pure. In it are books that are made straight. What does that mean? Scrolls, and inside the scrolls there are books, there are kutub, that the Prophet ﷺ is reciting kutub. What does that mean? According to the ulama, that means he's reciting the essence of the previous books, the correctness, kutubun qayyima. What is true, essentially, from the Torah and the Zabur and the Injil is also found in the Quran. That the Quran it affirms the truth elements of those books, but also renders them now obsolete, because now the revelation is the Quran, and now the Prophet is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we have we have this, so immediate eschatology, we have this idea, anti-Jewishness, it's very secretive. We talked about the messianic secret, we talked about the cross being a central motif of the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark, again, is essentially an extended passion narrative. Half of the Gospel of Mark talks about 1 week in the life of Isa alayhi salam. So that's what really counts for Pauline Christianity. So what we would say is then Jamesonian Christianity, if you look at the Ebionite Christianity, as opposed to Paul, the focus there is not on the death of Isa alayhi salam or the apparent significance of the death of Isa alayhi salam. That's what Paul is saying. The point of Jamesonian or Ebionite Christianity is, what is the religion of Isa alayhi salam? What is his actual teaching? That's what's important, right? Not a religion about him, but the religion of him. That's the difference between Pauline Christianity and what we would say Islamic teaching about Isa alayhi salam. The Muslim claim is that Islam is the religion of Isa alayhi salam, right? Whereas Christianity is a religion about Isa alayhi salam, where they're worshipping Isa alayhi salam. But we say no, Isa alayhi salam was not a Christian. He didn't say I'm a Christian. He never even heard of this word. He was a Muslim in the sense that he's actively creating peace in the world. This is what the word Muslim means, right? So the Muslims before the Prophet ﷺ were those who believed in the Prophet of their time, and that was Isa alayhi salam. So the word Muslim by itself does not technically mean a follower of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. That's not what it technically means. Nowadays, that's what it means, right? Because now we are in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. The Quran has been revealed, he was sent as a messenger. But before the Prophet was sent, who are the Muslims? Bani Israel, right? But when they rejected the Prophet ﷺ, they are no longer in a state of al-Islam. They're no longer in a state of submission, because some people who are perennialists, and this is people who actually masquerade as Muslims, they say things like Jews and Christians and Buddhists and everyone, all of these people are Muslims with a capital M. We would say no, they're Muslims in the sense that they submit, and they must submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything is in submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is Islam with a lowercase I, or Islamun with a tanween, indefinite article. Everything is in submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whether they're Muslim or Kafir, whether they like it or not, whether they know it or not, everything is in submission, right? Everything. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills everything, and He can will evil. He can will evil, but He doesn't call towards evil, nor is He pleased with evil. So this is very important distinction. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's part of His irada, His will, to will shar, evil. But He doesn't call people to do that, nor is He pleased with it. But al-Islam, alif lam, right, Islam with a big I, these are people who are following the guidance of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. These are people who simply want to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They want to actively please Him, right? They don't want to do evil. They don't want to disobey Allah. They want to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by following the guidance which was brought by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is the difference here. So this perennialist philosophy that is so prevalent in Western academy, that all religions are basically the same, and it doesn't matter which religion you follow. It doesn't matter if you believe in the Prophet ﷺ. It doesn't matter. Nothing matters. They're all the same. This is just patently false. And the reason why it's false is because of a logical fallacy, right? How can Christianity and Islam be both correct at the same time? How can they both be true? Either Isa alayhi salam is God or He's not. He can't be both, right? So the Quran is very, very clear. The Quran has a clear polemic against Christian theology, right? Very clearly criticizes Christian theology. If all religions are the same and it doesn't matter, why do we have this very prevalent polemic in the Quran against Christian theology, right? So, لَقَدْ كَفَرَ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ هُوَ الْمَسِيحُ ابْنُ مَرْيَمَ. It's very, very clear that whoever says that Allah is Isa alayhi salam, they have disbelieved. right? Now, we're not in a position to say, oh, this person's going to go to hell. No, we don't co-sign people to the fire. That's actually impermissible for Muslims to do that. We don't know how a person is going to die. We don't establish taklif for people. We don't know whether that person was exposed to a good prophetic summons or not. These are variables that are best left with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But what we can say is that this belief is upon kufr. Those who believe Isa alayhi salam is God, this belief is kufr. Whether that person is going to go to Jahannam forever, Allahu alam, we're not in a position to judge. If he dies upon that belief and taklif has been established, then indeed this person is in trouble. But that's not for us to judge. We don't know a person's state at death. We don't know our own state at death. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us husn al-khatimah, to give us a good ending. We should worry about ourselves and preach the message and make da'wah to people and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for hidayah for them. People forget dua. One of my teachers said that 50% of da'wah is dua. That if we're not making dua for people, then we're missing half of da'wah. Half of da'wah is speaking and doing this and organizing lectures and your akhlaq. The other half is dua. So we have to make dua for people, inshallah ta'ala. The final thing we said here regarding the major themes of the Gospel of Mark is the parousia, the second coming of Isa alayhi salam. Now, let's talk a little bit about Mark's source according to the vast majority of Christian scholars. So, Mark's Gospel is reflective of Hellenistic oral tradition, right? Hellenistic kerugma. Kerugma is a Greek word which means proclamation. So remember, when Isa alayhi salam preached his message around 30 to 33 of the Common Era, there's two distinct interpretations, at least two, but two major distinct interpretations of that message. There's sort of a Hellenistic understanding that Paul is bringing, which we would say is incorrect. And then there's a sort of Semitic or Jewish monotheistic way of interpreting the message that is exemplified by James and the other disciples. We would say that's correct. What Mark represents now is the oral traditions of Hellenistic Christianity, right? Of Pauline Christianity, the Pauline proclamation, the Pauline kerugma that is floating out there amongst these Pauline churches around the Mediterranean. And the reason why these things weren't written, it's probably oral tradition, is because the vast, vast majority of people at that time were illiterate and they simply can't read or write. So oral tradition was very, very strong. In fact, according to Bart Ehrman, at the height of Athens civilization in ancient Greece, the time of Plato and Socrates, 90% of the general populace did not know how to read and write. Right? This was something that only a few people knew how to do. Also, according to Ehrman and the majority of scholars, probably all of the disciples of Isa alayhi salam were unlettered people, unlettered men. They had simple craft. They were carpenters, they were fishermen, they were this and that. They didn't know letters. So everything is by oral transmission. But when you have things by oral transmission, of course, it develops the memory. So like the Arabs at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, also, many of them were unlettered, but the concept of sanad was so strong for the Arabs before Islam that they would not only memorize their own lineages back several generations, but they would also memorize the lineage of their horses all the way back several generations. And also poetry. They were masters of poetry in the Arabic language. And these two things, knowledge of sanad, knowledge of poetry, helped them recognize that this revelation is in fact from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And also in the promulgation of the hadith literature. When you're masters of sanad, then you already have that as part of your culture, as part of your expertise. It makes compiling the sunnah that much easier for that generation. So these are things that were done out of tawfiq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But here in the Gospel of Mark is reflective of that Hellenistic kerugma. And there's truth in there and there's falsehood in there. Because this is indicative of what Paul is teaching his churches, not what the Ebionites, the Semitic Christians are teaching, right? So basically, what Mark had then is a bunch of pericopes. Pericope is a Greek word which means literary units. He had these stories of Isa alayhi salam. You know, these sayings, these aphorisms, you know, the hikam literature, for example, parables, brief narrations that people were saying about Isa alayhi salam. So Mark has these things, you know, he has these oral traditions. But now Mark is able to write them down, whoever Mark is. We're conveniently calling him Mark, but we don't know the actual, again, these books are anonymous. The Gospel of Mark, we don't know who wrote it. But some educated Gentile Christian in Rome has all of these oral traditions. Now he's going to write them down. And instead of writing them down like Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said, like hadith, for example, or like the Gospel of Thomas, that's how the Gospel of Thomas is, Jesus said, Jesus said. Mark knows, because he's smart, that that's not going to fly with a Greco-Roman audience. That might fly, that might work with a Jewish audience, but the Greco-Romans are used to reading the Iliad and Odyssey of Homer. They want a narrative. They don't want just a bunch of statements. So what Mark has to do now is take these pericopes, these literary units, right? These aphorisms, these sayings, these parables. He has to make it into a narrative, a chronological narrative. So he has to put these pericopes into context. So the vast majority of scholars say Mark puts these pericopes in context that he simply invents. They're subjective and they're contrived contexts, you see. Because Mark doesn't know the context of these pericopes. But in order to placate his audience, which is a Greco-Roman audience, he has to have it into a narrative. For example, we read the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. We know that there was the Prophet ﷺ, he was taken to Jerusalem, Laylatul Isra wal Mi'raj. We know that he went to Ta'if for da'wah. We know that the Quraysh put a muqata'a, they put a boycott on the Bani Hashim. We know these stories, we know these pericopes of the Prophet ﷺ. But what is the chronological order of these, right? Somebody might say, who doesn't know the chronological order, perhaps the Isra was first. Perhaps the Isra was first, and then when he came back, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, okay, now I'll go to the Bani Thaqif. He went there, he was rejected. When he came back to Mecca, and then the Quraysh became angry because he went to the Bani Thaqif, and now they implemented the Muqata. And that makes sense, but that's not the correct chronological order. So even if something makes sense logically, as far as your justification of that order of events or that sequence, it doesn't mean that it's true. And this is the problem that Mark had. Mark has all of these stories of Isa alayhi salam, and he has to put them into a context in a narrative, right? So the narrative of Mark then is something that he invented. This is according to the vast majority of scholars of the New Testament. Okay? So, you know, we have a principle in usul, and, you know, the Hanafis have something a little bit different, but if you have, for example, two hadith that are saying two different things, right? They contradict each other. You have to try to make jam'ah, you have to harmonize them. Try to make them work. For example, it says, one hadith says the Prophet ﷺ, he had his chest split when he was a child. Another hadith says it happened on the night of the Isra. Which one is correct? The ulama say both of them are correct. It happened twice. This is called jam'ah. Or, if you can't make jam'ah, you have to make what's known as tarjih. You have to pick a tradition based on the preponderance of evidence. For example, if seerah literature says that a man named Labid put a spell on the Prophet ﷺ and he started to forget things, that's what seerah says. But the Quran says, Wallahu ya'asimuka minan nas, that Allah protects you from humanity, then Quran takes preponderance over seerah, right? So you don't have to believe in that story from seerah, because the Quran says very clearly, we protect you from these things that people are doing to you, right? So can this be done with the New Testament? This was actually attempted to be done by a Christian scholar named Tatian. Tatian lived in the 2nd century. He was a student of Justin Martyr, who's one of the chief architects of the Logos Trinitarian theology. Tatian, he took all 4 Gospels, because there's a lot of contradictions in the Gospels. And when we actually get to the Gospel of John, after we study Mark and Matthew and Luke, you'll see that there's so many discrepancies in these 4 books that it's virtually impossible to reconcile. Because you can't have, for example, something happen and not happen at the same time, right? So either Isa alayhi salam, he was either crucified on the eve of Passover or the night before Passover. It can't be either one, right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke says he was crucified on the eve of Passover. John says it was the night before the eve of Passover. Both cannot be correct. Somebody is wrong. There is no way to make jama'ah of this. Somebody has to be wrong, unless Christians believe that he was crucified twice, which of course is ridiculous, right? In fact, he wasn't crucified at all according to the Islamic Orthodox position. وَمَا قَتَلُوا وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ. We'll talk more about that, inshallah, when we get to the Passion narrative. But Tatian, what he tried to do is he took Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and he tried to harmonize them. And his harmonization is called the dia tesseron, which means through four, right? Through four. In other words, he took all four Gospels and he made it into a single narrative. And apparently he was able to reconcile all of the contradictions and discrepancies in the New Testament. I'd like to see how he did that. I've only read some of it. But the one thing he couldn't reconcile are the genealogies that are given by Matthew and Luke. And we haven't talked about Matthew and Luke, but Matthew and Luke give a genealogy, right? A lineage of Isa alayhi salam that are completely different, right? And he couldn't reconcile that aspect. So, Mark's source again. So to put things in perspective a little bit, you have the Gospel, the Evangelion in Greek, the Injil, revealed to Isa alayhi salam between the year 30, 31, 32, 33, right around there. So then you have what's known as oral logia. Oral logia. In other words, oral sayings, pericopes, right? Kerugma, proclamation. A risala, that's oral tradition. And you have two interpretations of it very early. You have the Semitic kerugma, right? You have the sort of Ebionite Jewish Christian traditions and interpretations. And then you have the Pauline or Hellenistic kerugma, right? So you have two different camps, and this happens almost immediately. So then, and this, these sayings proliferate in Palestine and around the Mediterranean in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And of course, Paul is now writing in the 50s, right? So when Paul is starting these congregations and making converts to his sort of school of thought, right? So that school begins to really grow and make a lot of converts. Now, in 70 or so of the Common Era, a person decides to write down these oral traditions of Jesus in line with Pauline dogmatism, and this person was Mark, right? So the Gospel of Mark again represents the Hellenistic Pauline interpretation of these oral kerygma, these oral proclamations, pericopes of Isa alayhi salam. In 80 or so of the Common Era, then you have the Gospel of Matthew. We'll talk about this. So Matthew was written about 80, 85 of the Common Era. Matthew, according to church tradition, is a disciple of Isa alayhi salam. Matthew, of course, is not a Hebrew way of pronouncing his name. It was either Matai or Levi, right? His actual name. But again, during this time, there's a sort of distancing of Judaism from Christianity. There's animosity between the two religions. So Matthew, the book of Matthew, which is our next gospel, is also anonymous. No one knows who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. So even when Matthew is talking about Matthew in his gospel, he talks about him in the third person, right? So in other words, Matthew doesn't say, and then Jesus came up to me and he said, follow me and I'll make you a fisher among... He doesn't say that. He says, then Jesus came to Matthew in the third person, right? So again, it wasn't until Irenaeus' time that these four books were named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All four Gospels, again, are anonymous. And more technically, they're pseudonymous. They're ascribed later on to disciples of Isa alayhi salam. So what does Matthew do here? Matthew, he uses Mark's Gospel as his sort of skeleton. So, you know how we said that Mark took these loose traditions of Jesus and he put them into a narrative. So Matthew, he takes Mark's skeleton. He likes that chronological order. Okay? But Matthew also has other material in his gospel. Right? He has material in his gospel that is not found in any other gospel. This is called M material, uppercase M, or Matthean material. Matthew also has material in his gospel that he has in common with Luke that is not found in Mark. Okay? Matthew has material in his gospel that is in common with Luke, but not found in Mark. That means that Matthew and Luke had a source of some sort that Mark did not have access to. And scholars have called this source, this hypothetical source, Q, the letter Q, which stands for the German Quelle, meaning the unknown. Q is also called the sayings gospel. Okay? So this actually work a lot better if I made a diagram, but let's explain it again, inshallah. And if there's any questions, email me your questions and I can explain this a lot better. Maybe I can give you a chart. But basically, you have Mark written in 70, the Common Era, then you have Matthew around 80, and Luke around 90. Matthew and Luke, they both take the basic skeletal structure of the Gospel of Mark, right? So 80% of Mark is incorporated into Matthew, and about 65% of Mark is incorporated into Luke, okay? And then Matthew and Luke also have material that they share that is not in Mark. That's called Q source material. So Matthew and Luke then, they had access to some other source that Mark did not have access to. Matthew also has material that's only found in his gospel. That's called M, Matthean material. And Luke also has material only found in his gospel. That's called L, special Lucan material. Okay? So this is really, really important. Now, Christian fundamentalists will say that Matthew is a disciple of Isa alayhi salam, and a disciple wrote the Gospel of Matthew. The problem with that is if Matthew is a disciple of Isa alayhi salam, why is he using the skeletal structure or the chronology of Mark, who was not a disciple of Isa alayhi salam? Mark is a student of Peter. Mark was not a disciple. Mark was 10 years old when Isa alayhi salam walked the earth. Right? He studied under Peter, but he's still not an eye and ear witness. Matthew is an eye and ear witness of the ministry of Jesus, yet 80% of Mark, Matthew will incorporate into his gospel. So this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, one more thing that's interesting. We talk about the Q source document, right? Again, to make this really, this is very, very important that we understand Q. That Q is some sort of document. It was probably written. It's probably before Mark wrote his gospel, right? That Mark did not have access to for some reason. Maybe Q represents the other oral proclamation, the Semitic Jamesonian school of Christianity, the true Christianity. Maybe Mark knew about Q and purposefully or intentionally did not use it in his gospel because he thought this is from the other side of Christianity. These are the Jewish Christians that are saying these things, right? That could be a possibility. But the mystery of why Mark doesn't know about Q is a mystery that continues to baffle New Testament scholars today. Matthew and Luke definitely had access to Q because they have material that they have in common that is almost verbatim. They're quoting things almost verbatim from some other source that's not in Mark, right? So what is Q? Now this is called the two-source theory. The two-source theory says that Mark wrote first, and then Matthew and Luke, they took from Mark's basic skeletal structure. That's called the two-source theory. It assumes Markan priority, that Mark wrote first and then these two other Gospels. There's another theory, which is very much in the minority, almost an extinct opinion, which is called the two-gospel theory, or the former Griesbach theory. And according to this theory, Matthew and Luke wrote first, and then Mark wrote after that. But the reason that this theory is not very, and this is the theory that Augustine of Hippo actually subscribe to. But the reason this is not very popular is that why would Mark, if he had access to Luke and Matthew, why wouldn't he record so much of these beautiful teachings of the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer, all these beautiful, the prodigal son, the Good Samaritan? He just ignores all of that. Why would Mark do that? It doesn't stand to reason why he would ignore some of the most celebrated teachings of Isa alayhi salam, if indeed he wrote after Luke and Matthew. The dominant opinion here is that Mark wrote first. There's Mark in priority. Mark wrote first, and then Luke and Matthew, they used Mark's skeletal structure to formulate their own gospels. And they have material in common. What is that material? It's called Q. What does Q contain? Parables of Isa alayhi salam, his hikam, his wisdom teaching, right? These are called aphorisms. What else? The ministry of John the Baptist, Yahya alayhi salam, is contained in Q. What else? The Sermon on the Mount, right? This beautiful teaching that we find in Matthew chapter 6, Luke chapter 11, which includes the Lord's Prayer and the Beatitudes, right? The series of blessings that Isa alayhi salam gives. Also, interesting, there's no passion material, there's no passion narrative in Q, right? In other words, there's nothing about the death of Isa alayhi salam in Q. There's nothing about even a passion prediction in Q, right? In other words, Matthew and Luke, and the material that they have in common that is missing from Mark, nothing in their material that they have in common has anything to do with the death and resurrection of Isa alayhi salam. What does that mean? That means the author of Q, whoever it was, maybe Jewish Christian community from James, they didn't value the crucifixion and resurrection of Isa alayhi salam. Why? Maybe it wasn't important for them, or maybe they didn't even believe in it, which is a possibility, right? So this is very, very important. This is called a synoptic problem, right? Dealing with the interdependency of these three gospels, right? Why does Mark not use Q? Did he know about it? Did he not know about it? What does Q contain? We can sort of ascertain what Q contained because it's simply what Luke and Matthew have in common, right? When we read what Q contains, none of it contradicts Islam. None of it contradicts Islam. So this Q, this sayings gospel, could actually be the Injil of Isa alayhi salam. But we haven't actually found anything. Matthew and Luke probably had something, but it's been lost to time, right? Maybe they buried it somewhere. Quite often, Christian archaeologists, they'll go on a dig. This happens all the time, and they'll find something extraordinary, right? Like in 1887, they found this document called the Didache. Didache is Greek for teaching, right? The Didache was written in the 2nd century, some say 1st century, and it represents the teaching of the disciples to Gentile converts. It's very interesting. It's like a church manual, right? The teaching of the disciples, the actual disciples, to Gentile converts. And something interesting it mentions in the Didache is that Christians will fast twice a week, right? So the concentration on the actual fasting and prayers and so on and so forth. This wasn't discovered until 1887 or so in a monastery, but scholars believe it was written in the 2nd century. Now, what's also interesting about Mark, we're going to finish up with Mark inshallah, is that there's actually 4 endings to the Gospel of Mark. So remember we talked about the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, that the beginning of the very beginning of the Gospel contains a fabrication. It says, Arketu Evangeliu Iesu Christu, the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ. And then it says, Huyu Theou, the Son of God. This phrase, Son of God, is not in the oldest and best Greek manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark. Okay? It was added later. Bruce Metzger, the president of the United Bible Society, he called it a scribal expansion. It's not found in the oldest Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. So this was an example of how the Gospel of Mark is Christologically anemic. It's very weak in its Christology. So a scribe went back and they had to sort of pad it a little bit and put that phrase in there. Now, if you look at the end of the Gospel of Mark, so the Gospel of Mark is the shortest of the 4 Gospels. It has only 16 chapters, right? And the true ending of the Gospel of Mark is actually 16:8, chapter 16, verse 8. So this is what happens. Basically, Jesus is apparently crucified, and he's put into a tomb, and then on Sunday, a group of women, they go to the tomb, they look inside, and they see a young man sitting in the tomb, and they say, and the young man says to them that basically, he's not here, he's gone to Galilee. And then it says, Kai udene uden epan efabunta gar. Then they said nothing to no one, for they were afraid. And that's the end of the gospel. That's the true end of the Gospel of Mark. What does that mean? That means basically we have no idea what happened to Isa alayhi salam. All we know is apparently he was crucified. They go to the tomb. He's not there. There's an angel, or maybe it says a young man sitting in the tomb. It says he's not here. He's in Galilee. Right? And that's the end of the gospel. What does that mean? That means that according to the earliest gospel in the New Testament, nobody sees a resurrected Jesus. Nobody sees a resurrected Jesus. In fact, it's quite questionable whether he was crucified at all. Because in the Gospel of Mark, if you read chapter 15, it says that after a few hours, Jesus had apparently died on the cross. And when this news was brought to Pontius Pilate, the man who made a profession out of crucifying Jews, it said he marveled. He couldn't believe it. This man is already dead after a few hours, 3 hours, and he's dead? Because he knew from experience it took days to die on a cross. And now we're told that the women go on Sunday to the supposed tomb, and somebody tells them, oh, he's not here, he's in Galilee. So what happened to Isa alayhi salam? This is very, very interesting. So the end of this gospel is very ambiguous. And the Christian scholars of the 2nd and 3rd centuries and the 4th century, they didn't like this ambiguity because they wanted to tell you, they wanted to drive the point home that he indeed was killed and he rose from the dead, right? So they added an ending to this gospel, right? They added. So the true end is Mark 16:8. That's called the true end. But then we have the longer ending of Mark, which is in later manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark. And here now, what does it say? It says that Jesus came and appeared to Mary Magdalene, and then he appeared to 2 disciples, right? Why 2 disciples? Because the true end of the gospel, it says that women went to the tomb, they saw it was empty, there's a young man, it said he's in Galilee, he's gone to Galilee, right? And that's the end of the gospel. A woman's testimony in Judaism in the 1st century is basically worthless, right? A woman's testimony is not taken into consideration in any court in Judaism in the 1st century, right? So what you need is male witnesses. So what happens here is that some clever scribe recognized the need for male witnesses. So he went back and added this longer ending where Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, but also to 2 disciples, male disciples, right? And then he commissions them. The commissioning of the disciples to go into all nations. And then he says something interesting to his disciples, according to his longer ending, which is actually a fabrication. He says to them that you'll speak in many tongues, you'll lay your hands on people and they'll be cured, you can drink poison and you'll live, you can handle poisonous snakes and it won't harm you, and then he ascends into heaven, right? This is the longer ending of Mark. What's interesting about this ending of Mark here is you have a group of Christians in America that are called Appalachian snake handlers. This is a sort of offshoot of what's known as Pentecostalism. These Christians who speak in tongues, right? The charismatic type movement. They're in the South in America. You have these Appalachian snake handlers who bring snakes into church and they handle snakes. And one of them recently, his name was Mark Wolford, he was bitten by a snake and he died. In fact, his father also died from doing the same thing, bitten by a snake. I feel like telling his son now that the scripture that says that you can handle snakes is actually a fabrication to the end of Mark's gospel. I debated a Christian one time. I don't know if this has been recorded. Maybe you can find this on YouTube. I debated a Christian one time. And this happened a couple times where I used this. It's really an old Ahmad Didat, rahimahullah ta'ala, old trick from Ahmad Didat. But it's very effective. And it's because I said, is the Bible the Word of God? He says, yes. And he said, are you a true Christian? He says, yes. He said, true Christians, according to Jesus, can drink poison and nothing can happen to them. So I took some white out, liquid paper out of my bag, which is not really poisonous, but it'll make you pretty sick. And I put it on the table and I said, I want you to drink this white out. And if you drink it and you survive, then you're a true Christian. And then you know what he said? This Christian man I was debating in a university, an academic setting. He said, oh, you're talking about the longer ending of Mark. That's a fabrication to the Gospel of Mark. And there was this collective gasp from the audience. They couldn't believe that he had said that. So I said, if it's a fabrication, here's my Bible. Rip it out of my Bible. It's a fabrication. Take it out, throw it on the ground. He said, no, I refuse to do that. So why do you refuse to do that if it's a fabrication? Right? So you can't have your cake and eat it too. Either fabrication or it's not. But scholars are unanimous that this longer ending of Mark is a later addition to the Gospel of Mark. So the earliest Gospel in the New Testament has a fabrication at the very beginning by calling Jesus the Son of God, and has a fabrication at the very end because it ends very briefly. It's like a cliffhanger, and we don't really know what happened to Jesus. All we know that apparently he was killed on a cross, and then suddenly there's an empty tomb. Was he resurrected? Was he actually dead? Is it the wrong tomb? What happened? We have no idea. So they went in and actually added this longer ending. There's actually 2 more endings of the Gospel of Mark, but the other 2 are not very important. But there's what's known as the shorter ending of the Gospel of Mark, which is in a few manuscripts, and then you have another ending of the Gospel of Mark, which is found in one manuscript called the Codex Washingtonianus, where he says a bunch of things about Satan's power over the age. There's a bunch of hapax legomenoi, these words that are not characteristic of Mark's writing style, and that's how you can tell that it's also a fabrication. So next time, inshallah, so we're done with the Gospel of Mark. Next time, inshallah ta'ala, we're going to go into the Gospel of Matthew. And the Gospel of Matthew is very, very interesting gospel, to say the very least. We're going to go through the basics, the who, what, when, where, and why of the Gospel of Matthew. We're going to look at the structure, the new characters of the Gospel of Matthew. We're going to look at the major themes of the Gospel, the sources. How did Matthew deal with the Gospel of Mark? Because he had Mark on his table when he wrote his Gospel. How did he deal with the Gospel of Mark? We're going to talk about that next time, inshallah. Sallallahu alayhi wa Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.